So, so in the sense that mathematics gives you, for the first time, the sense that there are true and false answers. 1 + 1 = 2 is true. And if you say, I think it's 3, they could kill you because you're sinning against the truth, right? And in the same sense, mathematics leads us to, if we're going to say that there is a highest God, that highest God can only be one. You can't have 2 or 3 highest gods. That's incoherent. It's a mathematical concept, though. But then eventually, and we can see that through things like the hidden face of God, this is the title of the book, that the monotheists in Israel kept modifying their concept. Initially, it was the highest God for them as a chosen people, and they had a contract, a testament with that highest God. And the deal was, as long as they didn't pay homage to any of the other gods, that one God would then be especially protective for them. Of course, they fell away a couple of times. Remember Baal, which is kind of interesting. Allah, you could have lots of fun with that. Elohim, right? So it seems like the expression all or El is essentially the concept through the Semitic languages for God. Still is. But there was a competitive version that was Yahweh. So that's kind of interesting. The Elohim is plural, which is, of course, a confusion. When you say, the Elohim spoke to Abraham, there's usually considered at least 3 in the group. Well, so what's the answer? Are there 3 gods? No, there's one God, but there's 2 angels accompanying him, something of that sort, right? Although strictly speaking, the text says Elohim in the plural, so who knows? In any case, that gradually changed and became the vacant seat. In other words, God could not be depicted and was the only God, and so did that find its accomplishment in the Israel probably post-Babylonian captivity that enabled them to establish their dogmatic representation of that? Or did it evolve when Jesus arrived and added more complexity to it by adding the idea that God was also man, specifically in Jesus, if that's what he meant, right? Let me get back to my notes. So we could go back and see the basic hunting narrative still. One of my favorite authors was Vine Deloria. If you've ever read any of his stuff, his book God is Red was fascinating. So I recommend that, God is Red by Vine Deloria. He has other books that are significant. I should show you him. I don't know why I didn't have a link for him. I think the most famous book that he wrote was Custer Died for Your Sins. But my favorite was God is Red. So I highly recommend it if you get the chance. It's not a big book. But so we have hunter-gatherer meta-narratives. By the way, the main thing about those hunter-gatherer meta-narratives is that they teach you how to live in a particular place. So, for example, native Alaskan shaman tales basically tell you how to cooperate with the game that are in a particular area. So basically the stories are focused on hunting, gathering, how to live, how to survive where you are. And that seems to be the level that stories start out at. So if you're ever puzzled by the lack of plot, all that the stories really tell you is how to move your canoe or your boat in order to find the game, and then you kill the game, and then you bring the game back home. That's the whole narrative, in a sense, usually. By the way, I also love the hero of 1,000 Faces. This is Joseph Campbell, if you're familiar with him. He was pretty significant. By the way, George Lucas, right, the Star Wars, right, has said in interviews that Joseph Campbell was his Yoda. So that's pretty cool. And also the Star Wars book, or rather movie, was based on the Joseph Campbell monomyth, so-called, which you could read all about. So here's the basic monomyth, the call to adventure. Seems so. There's subcategories here, but then you get to the first threshold and the trials, the abyss, transformation, apotheosis, which means becoming a god. So Luke becomes a Jedi, basically. Return, and then But so basically, George Lucas used this model. You could follow it and see how at least the first Star Wars movie is based exactly on this. So the idea was that Joseph Campbell in his book looks at all the important narratives, meta-narratives in all the different cultures he could find. I don't know if there's actually 1,000 of them. It's a boring book, by the way. It's kind of like a phone book of meta-narratives, not a book you could just interestingly read through. But what he discovers is that all of the important narratives have certain characteristics, and when you're looking at the most important narratives and the most important characteristics, they kind of move towards, of course, this kind of monomyth. So obviously not all meta-narratives follow this particular set of things, but ever since George Lucas produced Star Wars, all movies, if they're going to be successful, have to. So you could go through the list. Harry Potter, the poor kid, of course, his parents are taken away from him when he's a kid. He's raised in a horrible situation, but he has some special redeeming, magical powers, which comes out, and he ends up then having his mentors that teach him how to use those powers, and then he starts going through the various contests with the evil that keep getting more and more serious, until, of course, he dies. Eventually, he chooses to die. Yes? Is this going to ruin... I guess there's a lot of death in Harry Potter. That's not so. Let's do. Here you go. So he's just voluntarily allowed Voldemort to kill him, if you remember. And surprise, he wakes up in King's Cross. Which, is that a metaphor? Who's the king? You know. By the way, J.K. Rowling said she didn't respond to criticisms that her first book was satanic, witchcraft, anti-Christian, because she figured it would ruin the overall plot. You would eventually discover that it was absolutely Christian if you waited until the last stories, of course.
Brave man. Let us walk.
Professor, what is that?
But everybody's seen it, right? So, no, gosh, somebody needs to give this guy some more culture. He doesn't have any culture.
I have them all. I haven't watched any of them.
Well, now you know what you should do this weekend.
Not this weekend, after finals.
Oh, okay. In any case, Harry has voluntarily sacrificed himself for his friends. So how Christ-like, can that be? But he does choose then to come back. So after this discussion with Dumbledore, who of course has been dead for at least one book at this point, and famously, by the way, explains to Harry.
Voldemort has the Elder Wand.
Board a train.
Are you willing to take me?
On.
I think I'm at the right place, where he says, is this real or is this just happening in my head? Right?
Voldemort has the Elder Wand.
Shoot.
True.
And the snake's still alive.
Yes.
And I've nothing to kill it with.
Help will always be given at Hogwarts, Harry, to those who ask for it. I always prize myself on my ability to turn a phrase. Words are, in my not so humble opinion, our most inexhaustible source of magic, capable of both inflicting injury and remedying